All right, what's up, y'all? This is the Rising Tide Podcast. How's it going? I'm one of your hosts, Dayton Boys, followed by my co-host,
Dale Smith.
Awesome. We got an awesome episode for y'all today. This is our last episode of 2025. Give it up.
Made it through 5 episodes.
5 whole episodes. Is that how many we've been doing this for? Hell yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so we got 3 juicy stories for y'all today. We're going to be covering San Francisco's recent spate of blackouts. We're going to be talking about Jasmine Crockett's Texas Senate race, the international Gen Z protests, and we've got at least one update from the December 17th National Defense Authorization Act, which we'll talk about right in the middle. So we got a really exciting story for y'all today, and Dale, I think you're going to open us up. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely. So, for those of y'all that live in the Bay Area, possibly California, maybe even watch certain news outlets, you might have heard about a couple weeks ago, there was a major wave of blackouts that left 130,000 homes and businesses without power in San Francisco. That basically meant a third of the city was without power, and one of the busiest shopping days of the year. So this was caused by a fire at the Mission substation in the Mission district in San Francisco. And unsurprisingly, when employees went down there to look at the issue, they found out that there are a lot of other problems with the substation. And while they were fixing it, it caused blackouts to spread even further from the Richmond and Sunset districts to a lot of different parts of the city. So power would remain out for thousands of people, some of whom didn't get electricity until Tuesday morning. I know one person personally didn't get her power back on until like 4 a.m., which is absolutely ridiculous, completely unacceptable. And so, it caused lots of businesses to lose thousands of dollars in revenue during one of the busiest shopping days of the year, as I mentioned earlier. One of the most notable things was that Waymos shut down, blocking each other, causing major traffic jams in many different intersections. This is a moment that, went viral and made a lot of people start to question, like, are Waymos really such a good idea? Is it such a good idea that we're cutting Muni to, promote this private alternative that can't even work if there's a lack of power? Doesn't seem like it to me, but I think most importantly, though, it left a lot of people in their homes without power, causing them to lose refrigerated foods, and in some dire situations, important things like medication. There was one really important piece that was put out by Mission Local that talked about how there were some elderly folks that were basically isolated, and if it wasn't for, their neighbors and other people in their community who knew they needed to check up on them, they could have ended up in an even worse situation, And so, the issue did mostly end up being resolved for a lot of people the next day. But it's important to note that the quote unquote fix that the privately owned utilities company implemented involved running generators 24/7 until they eventually reconnected people back onto the grid over a week later, early or late at night. So all this happened, with this in the span of a couple days. But it's also important to note that there was another substation fire, which I mentioned in last week's news update, in the South Bay on Christmas Eve, which affected thousands of people. There were intense storms across the state that really tested the limits of the electrical infrastructure that PG&E has set up. And it left many people without power all throughout the state, not just in Northern California. So in reality, this is just a notch in PG&E's belt, given more than the past decade's track record that they have, the major pipeline explosion in San Bruno, the deadly fires that have destroyed almost 1 million acres of land. They've filed for multiple bankruptcies. They've consistently preferred to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and lawsuits rather than fix the problems they've been caught red-handed and neglecting. And this is their track record for over 30 years. Every time they get caught doing something that they're not supposed to, even when they have to pay the fine, even when they're supposed to be held accountable and fix these issues, they just pay the fine and move on, And why is that? Well, a lot of people, this is kind of, music to their ears, but it comes down to just the neoliberalization of these basic public utilities, the privatization of stuff like, electricity and gas and other things. When in reality, even in other parts of the state, other counties focus more on, public utilities, which is a thing that a lot of folks take for granted. When this ends up happening, it not only lowers the quality of these public services, but it just allows them to become less accountable over time. At least if there's, a publicly run utility or aspect of a social safety net, that you can hold somebody accountable for that. If it's a corporation, realistically, like the only people that's going to take corporation to task are the people, But yeah, so a lot of mess going on these past couple of weeks, but I'd be curious to hear just some of your thoughts about all of this, Dayton, and what do you think? What do you make of all this?
Well, my first question is, so PG&E's been in charge of SS Power for 30 years, you say?
Yeah, I think there was one thing I was looking up. It's like in 2003 they got caught for not having fixed stuff that they had previously been caught doing in 1996. So it's been happening for a long time now.
But before then, there was the public utility, and it was replaced by PG&E?
Yeah, I believe so.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, it's it's like the neoliberal playbook, right? It's that problems with the public service are sort of inflated to the point that they justify replacing with a private service. And then when quality still declines because it's a private service, people are just left, ass up, without a paddle, so to speak. I think it's interesting because I think from my understanding with that San Bruno fire, I think multiple PG executives had to plead guilty to manslaughter charges because the people who were killed in the fire.
There was a bunch of people that got killed. There was probably around 60 people that got injured.
Yeah, but I think, think of how ridiculous that is, right? You're part of a major corporation. That major corporation has some, responsibility to the public. You neglect that responsibility, you get people killed, then you just plead guilty to manslaughter, you pay a fine, and you stay in your job.
Pretty
right?
much.
Like it's crazy, right? Like imagine if a muni bus driver runs over a bunch of school kids. Can he just pay a fine and go back to work the next day? Doesn't make any sense.
The union's not going to protect that shit.
Yeah, so it's like rules for thee, but not for me, which is the main issue, right?
Yep.
There's also a time with all these problems with these Waymos going around, right? The Waymos couldn't connect without power. Rather, they couldn't get their Wi-Fi connection. They couldn't use their GPS, so they're just didn't know how to deal with all the flashing red lights,
Or lack of lights altogether, because some of them run on the actual traffic lights.
Yeah, and so you think of Mayor Lori talking about how they want to cut these muni funds to bolster Waymos. So it's this whole this privatization disaster just repeating itself, right? Yeah. Then we're gonna further make more cuts to public transportation to make more subsidies for private corporations that are going to be even less prepared and less willing to deal with catastrophes like these power outages, right? Mm-hmm. And so obviously we could just say that the solution to this is just a public utility for all. But I think there's always that good counter argument that even then the public utility isn't always often as good. So I think it goes back to the idea that, again, we as the people have to be engaged in these things. We can't just leave them off to experts or bureaucrats. Yeah. They're going to solve these problems. Because in this society, they just replace it with private companies. There's a thing that everyone's dealing with, right? You have the privatization of healthcare, the monopolization of housing, the big credit bubbles that are going on. What I always think is interesting is just the whole Lori administration, it's just been the whole intensification of propaganda, right? Mm-hmm. This whole approach has really been leaning into this sort of peace and law approach, right? Whereas the city's been so awful, but we're cleaning it up using technology and this new gung-ho SF attitude. But really, it's just all just the more of the same, right? It's more of the same. Yeah. While the big tech elites, since they control the big media, they control the media focus on this, right? And so instead of talking about the inadequacy of this private stuff, they just really they're continuing to push the narrative that what we need is actually more privatization, more tech and industry, more subsidies for private companies to take over the public utilities. So it's why it's important that we're all just talking about this issue. We can't just let these people literally keep getting away with murder.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that Lori did say in the aftermath of this is San Franciscans can't foot the bill for all of this. And it's yeah, but he's still not really making a push for a public utility company.
Yeah, because
again.
San Francisco's are footing the bill for all of
Yeah,
this, right?
pretty much. And I think like it's already somewhat of a talking point for a lot of people running for the governor's office, for Nancy Pelosi's seats, this and that. And there's a couple ways this can go. I think like there's a lot of people out there who it's like, we don't like this private company, but what if we have our own private company? You know, this idea of like, we're going to have like local autonomy over this. And instead of going to like, I don't know, it's called like Clean Power SF or whatever. It's like, what if like all these tech bros like come up with their own solution, as if any of their other solutions to things actually solve anything and don't cause more problems. And yeah, I think that's also a really important point that you're bringing up is like, there is a chance that, you know, there could be a really big push for this to all fully go back into the hands of, you know, the government. But that's not the end of it. You know, there's still a lot of stuff that needs to be done. It's not as simple as just like passing off the reins from one to another. You know, it's like like I said, there was the 2010 San Bruno pipeline explosion. A few years ago, there was the dim sum place on Geary Street in San Francisco, which burned down because construction workers hit a pipeline and they literally had to dig up, you know, an alternative because they couldn't reach the emergency shutoff valve. Even a couple months ago, you know, there was like a building in like, I want to say Hayward or something that blew up, you know, and these are all, you know, situations that they should have fixed over a decade ago. And it just by passing it off to the state, then it suddenly becomes a state problem. Then all these people who got rich off of gouging us for our electrical bills are still rich and aren't held accountable. So I think, you know, there's more to be done. But at the same time, yeah, I agree. The fact that it's making its way more into the conversation around this stuff is definitely a positive development.
Yeah, but again, there has to be like some kind of action, right? Because it's just so in vogue to talk about how terrible everything is, right? It's just so in vogue. What are we actually trying to do differently, you know? Because I think, you know, obviously, like, it's just like, because like what you're saying before, like we're not just saying that then we have to like then go with the ultra tech solution. It's like, oh, you're right, PG&E is awful. So what if we create a new San Francisco tech PG&E company? No,
Right.
absolutely not, right? And then you know, everyone can say all the different problems with the pre-existing public utility companies, but like we need an actual socialist utility company, right? One that's actually accountable to the people, not the bureaucrats. But, you know, that's like a larger issue, right?
It's not just sewer socialism in Milwaukee or whatever.
Yeah,
you know?
ridiculous. Yeah, sewer socialism. I like that term. You know, it's nice.
It was a thing. It's like it was a thing back in the day in the early 20th century where a lot of politicians in Milwaukee ran on a socialist platforms on this idea of like public utilities, public infrastructure. But that is also within the confines of, you know, the system that exists already. And I think the reality of it is like there's always going to be limitations to this stuff, especially when we live in like the center of empire. You know, we're never going to have a lot of the basic things that we see countries in Europe or even like some other countries that Americans don't like for one reason or another have, you know. And yeah, it's because like it's, you know, it's a necessary element to maintain what's happening.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. Want to keep it moving?
Yeah, let's move on to the next segment.
All right. So our next segment is talking about Jasmine Crockett, member of Congress representing Texas that has recently entered this upcoming Senate race. And so this has become a hot button issue right now because Jasmine Crockett is sort of like a rising star on the Democratic National Committee who's taken like a series of very like, you know, I will say like overt stances against the Trump administration. And at present, you know, her election could possibly win the Democrats a Senate majority at the upcoming cycle, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of energy's been put into sort of publicizing her campaign around the country. However, her recent races encountered a lot of criticism recently for a lot of her pro-Israel stances. And I think there's some misinformation shared that she had been receiving AIPAC funds. To my understanding, she is not a recipient of AIPAC money, but she's routinely, you know, voted in favor of sending arms to Israel, and has made a series of different statements, either touting Israel, under referencing the scale of the genocide in Palestine, and just basically taking what I would consider like the progressive Zionist approach, right? Like the killing is awful, but we still need Zionism in the Middle East, basically. Yep. And I think, there's been a series of liberal critiques of this stance, of this criticism of Jasmine Crockett. One, there's like the identity politics. People say like it's just inappropriate to criticize an aspiring black woman.
That's what the people say about Kamala Harris.
Yeah, right. It's like it's inappropriate to criticize people like Jasmine Crockett. It's inappropriate to criticize Kamala Harris because it's racist, right? You would never talk about a white male politician that way. It was like, actually, we do. We talk about them all the fucking time.
Because they're everywhere.
Because they're everywhere and they fucking suck, right? And so just because we have like new politicians that look different and come from different places but have the same exact policy tropes doesn't mean they're somehow immune from critique. That doesn't mean that we make a bunch of racist remarks toward these people, but we have to call a spade, right? And so this goes back to the liberal critique that like these leftists are never satisfied. It's like, oh, you're worried about the genocide in Gaza, but what about the stuff going on here in this country? It's like, well, they're inextricably linked, right? We can't just say, oh, the genocide is just the genocide, but I don't know, federal funding for social programs is another issue. It's like, no, they're inextricably linked because this country is way more interested in funding the genocide in Gaza than any social programs that any electoral races in this upcoming election cycle will impact for the average American, right? Like, within this piece, we also want to talk about the National Defense Authorization Act that was passed on December 18th, signed into law, which sends, I think, over $600 billion more dollars to Israel, right? As well as, prepares the military for dealing with climate change. This is the basic momentum, the inertia of our government. It's going to be pro-Zionist. It's going to send way more money to Zionists, to any community social programs. Unless we're actually able to wage some kind of ongoing militant struggle against that dynamic, we're not going to have any type of impact domestically. We can't just be, as a country, sending trillions and trillions of dollars to oppress people internationally around the world and then say, oh, well, we actually have to focus on these domestic problems first. No, they are one in the same, right? Which goes back to this idea that, leftists are never satisfied. It's like, we're not satisfied with genocide. That is correct. We are never going to be satisfied.
It's not even a bar. That's the floor.
Exactly. It's like we're never going to be satisfied with a genocide. We're never going to be silent about a genocide. And this idea is like, oh, well, there's other issues first. Like no other social program or social issue deals. Actually, I should say that. That's incorrect. Every social issue, social movement in particular, has to face this problem, right? With civil rights, right? Like the civil rights issues are too controversial this time. There's way better issues with advancing the New Deal politics than like pushing for civil rights. That was the notion back after post-World War II, right? Was that civil rights was just like not quite on the agenda because we had to continue advancing these liberal reforms under FDR, which, was a ridiculous point, right? Because what were these liberal reforms actually mean if the average citizen didn't have basic civil rights? What are you talking about, right?
And a lot of people in these movements were also contending with these deeper questions as well. Like Malcolm X and MLK both had opinions on Israel and Palestine. One of them had much better opinions on it than the other,
Absolutely. Which goes back to the basic idea, and they say, well, if you don't want Jasmine Crockett, then who do you want? It's like, I would like somebody that is able to oppose a genocide. That is the bar, right? That's at least the bare minimum. And we don't have that in this society because our current political system will not platform anti-genocide candidates, even the most liberal of them. You have liberal yimbys like Zoran Mamdani that their entire campaign is dogged by any associations with the Palestine Solidarity Movement. You have Cori Bush, who was unseated from her congressional position due to AIPAC counterfunding, right? She took a stance against the genocide, and immediately AIPAC moved to fund a competitor and to unseat her, right? So that is the basic calculus of this society. You have to at least be a moderately Zionist to even be like a viable candidate at all. Even people like Bernie Sanders, it's taken him 2 years of seeing babies being killed before he'll even use the word genocide, right? And he's like an independent. He's not even supposedly a part of the Democratic National Committee. He himself is even what I would call a progressive Zionist, if there's no such thing. But
it's just a term to discern the far right from a right-wing ideology.
Yeah, the far right, fascist, overtly fascist ideology from the sort of left center, semi-fascist, arguably fascist, will be fascist if there's a terror attack, Zionism, right?
Yeah.
They're people until they do anything that we don't like. Then they immediately become animals again. It's disgusting.
Yeah.
But it goes back to the bigger issue, right? This idea, this sort of criticism that the leftists, the progressive, are never satisfied, right? What does that actually mean? And I think it really just goes back to the basic nihilism of imperialist society, right? That the average liberal is unable to really conceive of anything outside of imperialism, U.S. imperialism, or monopoly capitalism. So any sort of criticism of that is taken as sort of like as a total idealism, right? Because they just cannot conceive of a world that does not have imperialism. But we actually think of the average person. The average person is quite curious about a world without U.S. imperialism and monopoly capitalism. They're actually quite curious about a world without occupation, genocide. And I think it's that basic solidarity that we have to coax out into the open, that we have to sort of nurture and develop.
Yeah.
And it's particularly difficult in this age of Trump, right, where everything is so heightened. The Trump administration just goes so far to the right just to justify center-right policies, right? So that's the Trump administration's basic policies. We're going to say the craziest fucking thing possible so that when we get just 1 out of the 10 things we want, that's a win, right? And the Democrats come in afterward and they say, wow, those 10 crazy things were awful. Then they put the one thing that Trump puts in place, we're going to keep that shit, because that's how they work. That's how the Democrats, Republicans work. The Democrats criticize Trump when they're not in power, but then when they get into power, they immediately co-opt whatever Trump policies are still in the books, right? They don't reverse the Trump policies, or they reverse the most egregious ones, usually just the cosmetic stuff. So when he puts racist art up in the White House, they take the racist art up and they put black women's faces up. But they don't actually change any of the policies, They might lower the ICE enforcement a little bit, but they still crank up the rate of deportations overall, right?
Yeah, in a lot of ways they build on them.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't end up opposing 100% of this stuff. They oppose it in their words, but they don't oppose it in their actions, And that's the thing that a lot of people have a hard time parsing through, and why a lot of people check out of politics, because it's you can't trust what these politicians say. It's yeah, that's right, you can't, because they aren't showing that they're worth shit.
Yeah.
Which
is why I think fundamentally we have to put forward being principled, right? But loyal to actual principles versus tribalism, because I think that's also the thing that comes down to. These liberals are trying to play on this idea of left-wing tribalisms. Well, you don't want to support the white supremacists, but you don't want to support our candidate. Ergo, you are a white supremacist or some kind of fascist.
I mean, yeah, there's a term that's come out recently that people are branding certain folks who are clearly Democrat stands on the internet, calling them blue MAGA or whatever.
Yeah, it's a solid one. It's the truth. It's the truth.
It's specifically guys like this dude, Good Trouble, or I don't know, that one redheaded dude on the internet who people. I know a lot of people that follow these folks, and they have good takes about some things, but when it comes to towing the Democratic line, they just turn into the most toxic, virulent people you'll ever meet. And that type of politic is not any different than we see from the more traditional, the red MAGA or whatever, because they are engaged in this form of tribalism. This is the type of thing that people really eat up, because they can't see outside of the scope of this two-party system. And it's it's my team, it's your team, It's the Bears or the Packers. It's the Giants or the Dodgers, or whoever the heck, When realistically, it's we don't have to play this game, We can do something different. And it starts by, like you're saying, being principled, putting those principled positions forward, adhering to that. And I think there's a lot of criticism to be have for Crockett's opponent Tallarico. I'm not too familiar with his politics, but he is better about talking about Israel and Palestine and stuff. But that doesn't mean people shouldn't just be uncritical of somebody just because they have better takes about this stuff. I think, for example, the person that comes to mind for me is the guy one of the guys that's running for Pelosi's seat. I think it's Saikat Chakrabarti. He really is trying to run himself out there I'm a progressive. I worked with Obama. I worked with AOC. I worked with Bernie. like I'm pro-Palestine, I'm against the genocide, and people really eat this stuff up. But then it's like, but wait, like, weren't you supporting all of these like AstroTurf candidates in San Francisco? Didn't you vote for the mayor and say he's going to do a good job even though he's a billionaire?
Yeah.
And it's like, I think there's going to be a lot of people that do this because like people honestly can't define what progressivism is because it is very eclectic in its nature. It's this idea that, we can, reform capitalism to the point that it actually works for everybody. And that's why you see a lot of these so-called progressive politicians have these really eclectic takes on different things. They might be progressive when it comes to Palestine and Israel, and they might say all the right things on the way to office, but then they'll turn around and do some completely whack stuff.
Yeah.
That's the thing that I think we really consistently see here in San Francisco. And like whenever, some politician comes running and like says like San Francisco is supposed to be a progressive bastion, people are looking to us for guidance and stuff. It literally makes me want to start screaming, no, it's not. And you know what? When people do that, people look around and they're like, you know what? They're right. Like, it's not. We shouldn't pretend that it is. We have to be realistic about this stuff. And like, ultimately, what we're asking for isn't that high a bar. Like opposing genocide isn't a bar that needs to be cleared. It's the floor. Putting forth like nominally progressive policies that help working class people is not a high bar to clear. And yet people can't seem to do it.
And then I think that goes back to like the liberal counter argument that says, okay, well, if you don't want these candidates, then the right wing is just going to win elections. And it's like, well, yes and no. And that shouldn't be seen as like a failure of the people, right? The idea is like the people don't want good solutions, so that's why we have Trump. It's like, no. We have Trump because Joe Biden and Kamala Harris refused to oppose the killing of men, women, and children, in a genocidal war. That's why we have Trump. That's why Kamala Harris was unpopular.
And also put affordability on the table.
Yeah,
that's the thing that they refused to actually implement in their first term, and then also refused to really campaign on.
They just campaigned on the basic status quo, which no one likes. Putting the idea is like, well, either you can have the status quo or fascism, and lo and behold, that's not so appealing to the average person so much anymore. And so as I see it, like, the only way the political system will respond is if folks take a stand to not participate in it. So if there are candidates that don't fit these basic principles, then no, we're not going to just vote for them because there's like some conservative boogeyman. There's always going to be some kind of Trump figure that the Democrats can use to try to scare people into participating in this basic electoral system. But if the result is more of the same policies that are put forward by the right-wing boogeyman, then I would argue, what is the difference? And some people get at me like if I say something like that. It's like, oh, well, here's a list of series of different social programs that are immediately cut by the Trump administration the Democrats wouldn't cut. It's like, okay, yeah, that's true, right? But we have to see this from a larger systematic thing. That if we actually can't leverage any kind of political power in this political system, then it does not matter how these regional elections shape up, because the basic interest of the monopoly capitalists will be advanced one way or another. Either we do it through tech billionaires or through Christian nationalist fascists. It's their real. That is the coin. That's the coin we're dealing with. Either we have the white Christian nationalist fascists or we have the tech billionaire monopolists. That's our reality. And so unless we're willing to oppose that reality by not participating in the system and actually building our working class proletarian power, or not, this is as good as it's going to get. And Jasmine Crockett is not the best we can do. Like these liberal genocide apologists, Zionist apologists, monopolist apologists are not the best we can do. And that's the point we have to continually put forward to people, even if it does seem difficult, and even if it can be quite scary the way they frame these boogeymen. But again, we're on our second Trump term. It's our second Trump term around this shit. Like, we have an understanding scientifically at this point about how a lot of this stuff can go. And while it is scary, it is terrifying, we have to understand this through actually building working class power, we can actually create a change we want to see.
100%.
All right. Do we want to go into the next story?
Yeah, sure. So For our last story, we're going to be talking about some international news, and we're going to be talking about the different Gen Z protests that we saw pop up all across the world. In 2025, we saw the rise of many international protests aimed at austerity, corruption, that, in theory, toppled governments in Nepal, Madagascar, and Bulgaria, as well as governments and the ruling classes of countries in places like Peru and Indonesia start to lose grip on the situation. These protests were largely dubbed the quote-unquote Gen Z protests, given that many of these protests were started by people who were born in the late 90s, early 2010s. A lot of the participants learned about this stuff via social media, namely TikTok. And many of these protests were, they had a deep nationalistic character, given that there was the prominence of their country's flags, maybe of different ethnic group flags, but were also unified by the use of the Straw Hat Jolly Roger flag from the popular anime/manga One Piece. What a time to be alive. Some of these protests did have some level of success due to the overall popular support. In Nepal, in particular, protesters burned down parliament and successfully ousted the prime minister. In Madagascar, they were able to gain the support of the military to get rid of their prime minister, as well as dissolve the National Assembly, albeit temporarily. And in Indonesia, the protests have been happening all throughout the year. In August and September, it was the largest protest that the country had seen in decades. Despite these protests in particular in Indonesia being smaller in scale, the fact that many youth and student-led organizations were consistently protesting stuff like tax hikes and authoritarian rule of the government, that's a really positive sign, and an extremely repressive society and government like one that lives in Indonesia. However, despite the cries of many who are calling for revolution, these protests in many instances have largely been pushing for reforms within the confines of liberal democracy, pushing out one group of political elites in favor of another, and in some instances really not changing a whole lot. So a lot of different examples of how this didn't really result in substantial change in the situation. So I think one of the biggest ones is in Madagascar. Many of the youth were dissatisfied with the new leader, might butcher this name, so it's Michael Randrianirina, who's appointing Salama Rajan Rivielo. Sorry, I'm going to need to work on that. So he's appointing this new person to power, but a lot of the people were disappointed because it's like, wait, like the previous prime minister was going to appoint this very same guy. So how is that any different? It's not, maybe he has a little bit more, fire. Maybe he has a little bit more fire under him. But at the same time, it's like they was going to appoint the same person. In Nepal in particular, we saw the frontrunners for this next general election include members of the centrist RSP party and the former ruling party, the supposed Marxist-Leninist CPM-UML. And they've met together. They've met with the new prime minister, the temporary one who was appointed, Sushila Karki. And after this meeting, it left her saying, the government is committed to guaranteeing a free and fear-free environment. We are working in a manner that leaves no room for doubt. So what does this really say? It says that despite the positive aspects of these protests, the reformist elements of them have brought things back full circle and leave serious doubts as to whether or not the result will lead to substantial change for the masses in Nepal, Madagascar, and many of these other countries. Furthermore, we did see in Mexico in particular that these protests were organized by PAN and PRI, which are both right-wing parties. They were calling for U.S. intervention in Mexico and were actively aligning with far-right extremists, using the messaging and images of other protests to create the facade that it was an organic grassroots movement led by the youth aimed at corruption and austerity in the government. There are even reports that millions of dollars were pumped into bots on social media, which had been dormant for some time, and then suddenly came around and started pushing all this political content to create the idea that this was a viral political moment, when in reality it wasn't. However, it's not to be all like doom and gloom around the situation. I think overall the fact that we saw a lot of youth being activated in different parts of the world, calling for accountability, calling for an end to corruption, calling for an end to austerity. These are all really positive things that we're seeing, and hopefully things that people will build on over time. This stuff isn't going to happen overnight, and I think we can't look at they're saying oh, they overthrew the government in this place. It's like, did they really? Not yeah, technically they did, but if it's just turning the wheel a little bit to get back to a similar point, it's not really that different. But I think we also saw in some places, in particular in the Philippines, how these protests could be more successful. So in the Philippines in particular, there are a lot of anti-corruption protests that were aimed at the controversy around the flood control projects in the country, where tsunami relief and protection funds had been embezzled by the ruling elites. And these protests were mobilized by a large network of political organizations in the Philippines and also internationally, and it led to over 130,000 people participating in some demonstrations. That's a lot of people. And these protests are and still are continuing up until this day. It's going on for almost 5 months at this point. I have confidence that this is going to continue because we're talking about not just a spontaneous movement, one that's actually built on, pre-existing organizations like ones that are a part of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, and they have a strong foundation, they have clear demands, and they aren't just focused on the idea of pushing out one politician for another, which has been the results of other ones. So, overall, a lot of these protests have been a lot more mixed than I feel like a lot of the, snippets of media that we have seen come out in news outlets. But there have been some positive elements. And yeah, I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts about all this are, Dayton.
Well, I think it's important to understand that societies are controlled by classes, not individuals, right? Particularly it's particularly with societies that deal with, say, military dictatorships, for instance. It can be really challenging to not see fast the cult of personality that these people put around themselves. But fundamentally, we're talking about countries, societies that are dealing with what's called class conflict, the contradicting interests between different classes of people. And I think we also see kind of the limitations of the spontaneous protest movement. In all these different countries, most of them have largely been spontaneous movements against corruption, against totalitarianism, against anti-democratic practices, but they lack the real ability to coordinate at a national level and coordinate a national campaign with demand, with a platform, with a vision, and then have the ability to actually continue advancing class struggle beyond just the single resignation of an unpopular people, an unpopular person, unpopular politician, and hence the need for political parties, right? The working class people, the peasant people in these different societies need the representation of a political party to actually be able to wage this struggle. Here in the developing world, we're very anti any type of hierarchy, particularly the hierarchy of a political party if you're on the left, right? But I think the reality is history shows that without the actual leadership of a political party, these movements they're always prone to reversal. I can think back just the real excitement and adulation around the revolution in Sudan is one example, where a lot of these spontaneous demonstrations against the 30-year dictatorship there were sort of were really muted. That after the resignation of this one of I think it was Bashir, can't recall the actual dictator's name. It doesn't matter. We should forget him, right? Is that this spontaneous movement was able to push the military junta to create some kind of caretaker administration between civilian rule and military rule to create a peaceful transition into democracy. And of course, what happened? These different military factions pushed out the civilians who lacked political representation, lacked any type of means to, which themselves lacked any means to hold the military to account. And these different military factions broke down and are now been engaged in a brutal civil war ever since, right? That's led to genocidal conditions happening in Sudan with starvation, right? With different foreign governments, including the U.S., being involved with funding different sides of the civil war. And that was the result of the fact that the people's movement lacked leadership to actually curtail that and stop that. right? And so I think that's why it's so important that we look to movements like the Philippines. Well, what does the Philippines have that these other societies don't have? It's like, well, they have like the actual Communist Party of the Philippines that plays a leading role in these pro-democracy, new democratic protests, right? That are actually pushing for actual democracy, the end of semi-feudalism, the end of the semi-colonial status of the Philippines. And they have some involvement in these different spontaneous demonstrations and actually put forward some leadership. And I think it's interesting with stuff going on in Mexico because it's so important that we have to understand this is not a grassroots movement. This is a movement of the right wing trying to get their piece of the pie. It's almost like a right wing's No Kings protest, basically, is what it was, but with much less grassroots appeal. Because again, my understanding was that many of the major student and youth groups in Mexico, vocally denounced these demonstrations as being astroturf, is what we call artificial movements. They're just pumping money into them through the online presentation. They're paying people to go out these demonstrations to present the sort of the liberal, semi-progressive presidential administration there as if they're the devil. It's like, I don't necessarily think that the president is the current president of Mexico is like the solution to Mexico's problems, particularly their semi-colonial status and their reliance on the United States. Absolutely not. But to say that that's somehow some basis for increased military intervention in Mexico is ridiculous. It's a right-wing talking point. It would only be worse for the people of Mexico, and it's clearly not in the interest of the average Mexican citizen, right? So we can look through this and use this analysis, do a little investigation, see there's more going on here. And so I think that's just the thing we have to understand, that the spontaneous movement against the awful things in any society can only go so far. We need the actual leadership of political parties to actually take these things beyond spontaneous upsurges and to actually make lasting change, to actually change which class actually rules society. Because in all the societies we've seen that basic calculus hasn't been shifted. In Nepal, the bourgeoisie, the semi-feudal elite, they're still in power. Right, they're still in power. Same with Madagascar, same in Mexico, and same even in the Philippines, although there's demonstrations right now have been much more robust. And so there's a lot more hope there, actually. And for the revolutionary movement in the Philippines in general, because they have the leadership of actual revolutionary parties that actually represent working class and peasant people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, the spontaneity of these protests, that, like I said, that in itself is a positive thing. But in order for it to go beyond that, there has to be actual organized resistance. There has to be actual real leadership being developed in these movements that can actually push it forward to creating a different society, or even for pushing for new leadership, if that's really what people want, though I don't necessarily think that's going to be the best solution necessarily. Because, it's like if you look at Nepal in particular, it's like they appointed this, short-term prime minister, and in this next election, it's the same political parties that are going back into it, and so even if the base of like what people's political consciousness is like, we don't like these politicians, we want somebody new, folks have to be able to at least put those folks forward with like some sort of platform, with some sort of demands, as cool as it might be to see on the internet where it's like, oh, they like got rid of the prime minister and they like burned down parliament and they like, were like tormenting the biggest billionaire in the country. It's like, but what happens after that? It's like, if that's all that was happening and it's back to where things were before, but like the needle being moved like a little bit, that's still a long ways to go before things really change for people, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
All
right. That was pretty good. I like doing the 3-story thing. The 3-story bit is nice, because then we're not just talking for 2 hours.
Yeah, this is probably going to be our shortest episode so far, but it's short and sweet.
And so it's all packed full.
Good way to wrap up this year. Just want to say thanks to everybody who's watched this episode, who's been following us on social media, who's been keeping up with the different things we're posting, the different content we're producing. We're going to keep at it. We're going to keep putting stuff out there in this new year. And appreciate everybody's support. Please, after you give this a watch, please remember to give it a like. Please feel free to share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, please subscribe to us. We really appreciate any kind of support you'll give us.
As well as any feedback on the episodes.
Absolutely.
We're coming into 2026. We want to make this show engaging for people. Maybe it might be educational. We want to not just be putting out just raw analysis, but also good ideas that folks can take with them into their communities. So if y'all have any suggestions, any criticisms, any things you want us to cover, we're always open. We're always open to it. Unless your ideas are terrible. In that case, we'll be very polite and still pretend to take them to heart. But we probably won't. But we're smart. You're smart. It's going to work out, okay? So just chime in. We need y'all to engage with this platform in order for it to grow. And I'm really excited for next year.
Absolutely. Happy New Year, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. And we'll see y'all in the new year.
Catch you later, y'all.